Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Tuesday, July 25th, 2023. For those of you who might be new to this format, every other episode, what I do is I take live questions from our live audience. I answer them in the order that they're received. You can always send in questions ahead of time or in between broadcasts by emailing webinar@evoketherapy.com. We'll always take the pre-submitted questions first. So we'll get to those in just a second, then we'll take the live questions as they come. So with that, let's get into the first pre-submitted question. Somebody writes, does overdiagnosis lead to overprescribing of drugs? I mean, the simplest answer is yes, of course. Overprescribing is automatically going to lead to the overprescribing of drugs. I think the challenge is that there are some of us who are sort of instinctively biased against or for medication for issues, and I think both of them can be their own kind of problem. Those of us that are biased against medication, maybe we see it with stigma, or we see it as a weakness or a crutch. And I won't give the several analogies, of course, comparing it to physical ailments and the fact that we need medications for that. But it definitely can be something that is overprescribed. It can also be something where in overprescription, the idea is that there's a dilemma there, there's an issue there, there's a question, there's a life challenge that needs to be addressed. Oftentimes, the overprescribing versus the underprescribing that I was just talking about comes from parents who in fact, both can come from parents, both can come from anybody. But sometimes parents that are, of course, understandably interested in managing disruptive behaviors. So in both cases, either underprescribing or overprescribing, we want to be as open as we can. We want to listen to experts that we trust. As I always say when it comes to mental health issues and working with therapists, psychiatrists, and professionals, you have the right to ask really difficult questions, and you have the right to have really intelligent answers to your questions. The idea of, if you feel yourself, and this goes more broadly, if you feel yourself being reluctant to challenge the therapist, to give the therapist feedback, to share with the therapist or the psychiatrist how you feel about things that they say or do with you, there's a couple of things going on there. And one is, it might be from your own background because you grew up in families like most people do, where challenging authority figures went really poorly for them because the authority figures were able to twist the communication, twist the feeling, twist the feedback, and put it back on the child. Or it could be that you sense from the professional a fragileness of ego, that you're having a read on how they might react to it. And like all things in psychology, like all things when we're considering what's ours and what's the other person's, it takes practice, it takes openness, it takes asking yourself difficult questions. There's not one simple way for me to suggest to you that how to figure out which is which. I suppose if I thought a long time, I could think about some signs or some evidences. But the best way that you know if you're working with a professional who's an adult, and I say that very clearly, the best way that you know that you're working with a professional who's an adult is to give them feedback, to ask them tough questions, to share with them feelings you have about them and about their process, especially when those feelings aren't pleasant necessarily. It's in those moments, in those instances, and relying on how they respond to you, that you figure out that you're able to measure whether or not you have a therapist, a psychiatrist, a professional who's done their own work, who's grown up, who's matured into adulthood. Many therapists, many psychiatrists, many professionals will carry with them the same wounding from childhood, the same patterns from their family of origin. And so if they respond with defensiveness, if they respond with a criticism of you, like you're being too needy, you're being too difficult, you're being impossible, and of course the examples are endless. If you have those kinds of responses, then you know that you have a professional that's not done their work, that's not mature, that's not an adult, that's not being responsible and accountable as a professional. So yes, it can go both ways. It can be underprescribed because of the stigma, because of the shame, because we see medication, especially with mental health symptoms and issues, as a weakness, and it can be overprescribed because people are trying to manage behavior. And there is still some emotional energy there that can be put to use therapeutically. But I don't want to suggest in either case that I have a blanket opinion about it, one way or the other. We at evoke therapy programs in my own practice, I am agnostic when it comes to medication, meaning that I'm open to the science, I'm open to the individual case, and I can see examples of the over or under medicating. But by and large, medication is a huge benefit in our culture, and there are so many people who can't even get into the starting gate. That's the way I like to think about medication. Medication gets you into the starting gate. It brings you to the game. It gives you enough energy, enough optimism, enough of a mood that's not too depressed or manic or distracted, whatever the case might be, so that you can make use of skills and tools and books and podcasts and psychotherapy, of course. That's my idea about medication. Thank you for the question. Somebody writes, I have a child with debilitating, paralyzing social anxiety and depression. I've been listening to Brad's podcast for years, and I feel like every single thing he says can apply to our situation, even if he's talking about addicts or rebellious behavior. My son is neither rebellious or an addict. But of course, as Brad always says, all therapy is the same, all building a strong sense of self. My issue now is this: how do we express the deep desire for my son to have his own boundaries and a sense of self, while also discouraging avoidant behavior, his coping mechanism of choice? I feel like he could disguise his avoidant behavior as boundaries. Thank you for your help. Leave that up there for a minute, Olivia. I want to take bits and parts of this one at a time. I'm going to start from the end and go backwards and answer the question in the first part of your question. The last part of it is this idea about people setting boundaries. I cannot tell you the numbers of times that folks have shared with me that their partner or their child or their parent, their significant other, or just the other person in their life in the story, starts to set boundaries, and the person on the other end of that boundary perceives that they're doing it to punish, that they're doing it to hold you hostage, that they're doing it to feel sorry for themselves, for a pity party. And what I've learned about this process is this: the work is the same in all of those cases. A healthy boundary, a pity party, punishing you, the work is the same in all those categories, which is you have to manage your response to the boundary. The best way to encourage somebody that you're in a relationship with to have healthy boundaries is to respect their boundaries, even in situations like these, in many, many cases. The second principle attached to that is it's not really your purview or prerogative to judge somebody else's boundaries. Boundaries hurt. Boundaries feel rejecting. Boundaries can be triggering. Boundaries can cause rage. All of those reactions to boundaries that I just listed can be present in somebody, even if the other person is setting boundaries from the purest place. So put yourself on the other side of the equation of you setting boundaries. Part of what I teach, part of what anybody who talks about boundaries with any kind of knowledge of boundaries will teach you is that you get to set them. Period. Full stop. You have the right to set a boundary without explaining yourself, without justifying the boundary. So what I would say is most people are going to be triggered by boundaries. It's not your prerogative to judge or determine if somebody's justified in their boundaries or is using it the right way. Now, down the line, if nothing ever gets talked about, if after somebody takes some time, they don't come back to the conversation to re-engage, so forth and so on, maybe there's something there. But for you to simply stand to the side, to be hurt or upset by somebody taking a boundary, and then to label, to attack, to analyze, to criticize their boundary and what they might be doing just beneath the surface, means that you've now become part of the problem. You now become the problem in that dynamic. So that's my first part about it as it relates to boundaries. You get to take them as they teach in Al-Anon. No is a complete sentence, and you have the right to draw a line to take care of yourself, to make the situation and circumstances feel safe, and you don't owe anybody a justification or an explanation necessarily. Back to the question, how do you walk that line between encouraging your child to take some risks, to get outside of their comfort zone, and at the same time honoring the crippling, as you mentioned, paralyzing anxiety that they might have? Well, I don't have an easy answer. It's kind of like what I was just describing with the diagnosis and the prescription of drugs, in the sense that it takes a long time. It takes a long time to figure out who you are, to figure out what is yours. I was sitting at a training not too long ago. This is the same kind of answer to a different kind of question. I was in a training a long time ago with my therapist and with probably about 25 of our therapists at our program. And at one point, one of the experienced older therapists said, sometimes in a session, I don't know what is theirs, which the reaction that they're having is because it comes from their background or it's coming from my background. If I'm having a reaction to them because of my own background, a very simple and easy to understand question from a therapist. My therapist, being the sly person that she is, simply responded to that person and said, "You're right." And then she went on to answer somebody else's question. I pulled that therapist aside and I said, "I know my therapist. I've known her for 24 years, 25 years now. I want to talk to you about what she said." And I was explaining that part of her funny way of responding to you was to say, "That's the question." I remember a good friend of mine who's since passed away, Sanford Shapiro, was teaching about learning difficulties, learning differences and disabilities to our field guides, and helping them understand how you might work with different people, how you might make accommodations for people with specific learning disabilities. And somebody asked the question, how do you know if they're just making excuses versus if it's a legitimate, real limitation that they just can't necessarily respond in the way that's expected of them in a mainstream way? And Sanford gave a very similar answer. He said, "That's the question. That's what you figure out over time." So I guess what I'm saying to you is I don't think there's one simple answer, one simple template that I can give to you and that you can apply to your son. I think you can have this conversation. I think you can ask challenging questions and ideas. As you say, like as you express the desire for your son to have his own boundaries of self, that support that you give him, and also say on the flip side of that, there are times when all of us, to grow, to progress, to get something that we want, simply have to step outside of our comfort zone. Can we have a conversation about that? Can we talk about what it's like for you? Can we talk about what it's like for me? Can we talk about when I feel triggered that I don't think you're putting the effort? What's that sound like to you? Can you talk about times where you don't feel like you're being supported? Can you come up with examples where you have found yourself responding to your first instinct to withdraw, to avoid? Can we talk about that? So I think it's conversations. I think it's, of course, lots and lots of self reflection. And at the end of the day, so much of this work, what I'm about to say is true for so much of this work, you get to decide where you determine your answer to be. And I think the only thing I would offer is hold your conclusions lightly in your hand, metaphorically speaking. Hold your assumptions lightly. And what I mean by holding things lightly is be open to the possibility that you could be wrong, but not so much so that you're never allowed to set a boundary. When I talk and teach about the idea that we get to set boundaries in our life, we get to draw lines in the sand that keep us safe, but that we don't get to be right anymore. Those aren't exclusive of each other. In fact, those in essence are the same task. You get to take your best guess, best shot at it. Holding it loosely means you're open as more data comes in. But if we can't make a decision to hold a boundary, to hold a limit, to follow through on a consequence or a privilege with a child because we're not sure of ourselves, well, the fact of the matter is you can never be sure. In fact, I would want to say to most people that I deal with in a therapeutic setting, you never fully know. You never fully know. I talk and I teach with people about this idea that sometimes people, for example, dealing with a boundary, sometimes people need to know if it's a healthy boundary in order to feel like they can support it. Well, that's not your purview. You get to decide. You get to decide. Do your work, have discussions about it, push, accept some pushback, and work your way through it. And eventually you'll come to places and situations and decisions where you'll feel more comfortable. But the point of feeling comfortable, and this goes to all of you, the point of feeling comfortable isn't to be perfectly sure without a shadow of a doubt. Is to accept the fact that you're a fallible and perfect human being, and that's enough. That's enough. You don't need more. No matter what you were taught from childhood, no matter what you grew into childhood, into adulthood believing, your feelings are enough to set a boundary. Somebody asked the question, this is a live question. What are your thoughts on multi-generational trauma and the role of epigenetics in mental health? I'll take those two parts. I think it's clear to me, crystal clear, easy to see how I and other parents take their unhealed wounding and put it on top of the child. Ask the child to carry it forward. Everything that I talk about when I talk under the umbrella of doing your work, learning to love your horrible, rotten self, you don't get to win. Setting better boundaries, not stricter or more permissive boundaries, but better boundaries come because they come from a place of awareness, focusing on what you can change versus what you can't change, accepting grief and loss and letting go of things that you can't control, including other people, all the things that I could talk about. When I talk about all of these things, I'm talking about whether or not we're going to pass on our trauma to our children. If we haven't learned to love our horrible, rotten self, then we will pass on our insecurities. We will pass on our shame and our guilt to our children. And the way that we do that is we will make them the problem. Like I've said before about my mother, just using one generic kind of general example. If my mother could have owned her insecurity more, she wouldn't have made me feel like I was too much. She could have just said, it's just my inadequacy. It's just my insecurity. It's just me feeling overwhelmed. Remember, children don't need you to be omniscient and omnipotent. They don't need those things from you. They don't need you to have all capacity. If they need you to have all capacity, all patience, perfect love, they are doomed, period. What they do need from you is they need you to make your life the project. Nobody likes to be the project. And when all of the energy and the focus is on the child's problem, the child learns implicitly through that process that I am the reason for my mother or my father or my parents' unhappiness, my parents' frustration. And then they go out in the world with that susceptibility, that vulnerability to what everybody else thinks and feels about them all the time. That's what we're working through, right? So definitely we can pass on our unhealed, unresolved trauma for sure. We also pass on our healing and our wisdom. One of the things that my adult daughter said to me, I was just commenting a few months back on how much farther along that she is at her stage of life compared to where I am at my stage of life. And I said it many times, and she said, "Dad, I just want to point out that you were the first person in your family, in your lineage, to really do your work. So I didn't start from the beginning. You started and you encouraged us to go to therapy and you invited us to go to an intensive, or you made it available to us, I should say. So I had a head start on you. And I appreciated that. Just as we pass on our unhealed and undealt with wounding and trauma, we pass on our healing. And I've said this, I've written this recently, that if you could look into the future, you would see all of you that are listening to today, tonight, whenever you're listening, you would see that the ripple effects that come from your healing, from your journey, have an effect into generations to come. Epigenetics is how the genetics that we pass on to our children can be affected by the circumstances, the environment, our nurture setting, if you will, which means everything that happens to us in life, right? Our genes can change or be affected, and although genes themselves don't fundamentally change, how they become activated changes. That's what epigenetics talks about, is that genes can be activated in a certain way. How does a gene know that's part of the eye to be an eye gene versus the gene that's in our liver know to be a liver gene, and the gene that's in our toe to be a toe gene? Epigenetics is the study of how environment shapes the parents, shapes the genetic gifter, if you will, and how it can turn on and off certain switches. And so we don't know a lot about it, but it seems very clear to me. See, I wrote this the other day. Anybody, and there are people, very, very famous, well known people, and I'm not going to mention them by name, no matter what you say to me. There are very, very popular and famous people talking about trauma these days. And some of them say it's all environment, it's all trauma, all mental health, all addiction. I have multiple sclerosis. All diseases like that are trauma. And there are others who focus, of course, a lot more on environment. And what we learned in graduate school many, many years ago was it's never all one thing or the other. It's always both. It's not like everybody who puts their wounding on a child affects the child the same way. The child has their own nervous system, their own genetic makeup, their susceptibility, their vulnerability to certain kind of energies and influences is different, and no two children are the same. And I've learned that from my clients. I have clients who have said to me, even if my parents were quote unquote good enough, I would still be dealing with shame and guilt at a significant level. And it's true. Nervous systems have varying levels of sensitivity. So it's both, it's all. I get asked once in a while if genetics plays such or epigenetics plays such a significant part in human trauma and human mental health and physical health, if it plays such a large part, why do you spend so much time talking about parenting and parenting skills and tools and concepts and ideas? And my answer to that is very simple. It's because we have some clear control over that stuff. It's really hard. I mean, you can have an impact on epigenetics if you're healing and becoming more and more regulated, for sure. But it's really hard to fundamentally have an impact, or nearly impossible in some cases, to have an impact on which genes you pass on to your offspring. So we can't control that. But we can control our behavior, our response over time. See, when people talk about therapy, I think there's this misunderstanding that therapy or psychology, when incorporated into a person's psyche, just fixes everything. It takes time, years, a lifetime. And that's why I say that to when I train therapists, one of the most important outcomes of good psychotherapy is that the client wants more. The client wants to come back next week and the week after that. That's one of the most important outcomes of good therapy, because we never arrive, right? There's always, in fact, the more you grow, some of you know this very clearly, the more you grow, the more you become aware, the more you're aware of what you don't know and how much more you have to grow. People that have done very little work on themselves don't even imagine that there's a lot of growth to be had. So we keep working because it's the thing that's within our control, and we keep working for the rest of our life. And whatever version of that looks like. And it's not laborious. And I hear people talk about, eventually you got to stop going to therapy and live your life. The fact that I go to therapy on Fridays from 11 to 12 doesn't mean I'm not living my life. It means I've dedicated an hour of the week to myself. I've dedicated an hour a week to somebody who can listen and attune to me. Give me feedback. Teach me. Offer me a safe place, sometimes just to vent and be myself. So this idea that therapy is something that you graduate from because you rise to a certain threshold, that can be true for some people, of course. Anybody can decide. Anybody can decide. And I hear stories where therapists try to talk clients out of going to therapy, and I cringe at that. In my training, therapists don't decide in an outpatient setting with adults. Parents don't decide when somebody's done with therapy. Excuse me, I'm going to re-say that. Therapists, therapists don't decide when a client is done with therapy. They don't graduate them, and they don't fire them, or when the client stops wanting to go, they don't try to talk them into it. That's just the way that I've been trained. And I feel pretty strongly about it. I'll try to hold it a little bit loosely, like I suggested earlier, but I feel pretty clear about that as a fundamental concept in psychotherapy. Somebody writes, in response to the first question regarding overdiagnosis and prescribing medications, our son was 16 already on medication for anxiety and ADHD when he started Wilderness, and our therapist suggested neuropsychological testing. I agreed, knowing he was already diagnosed, as long as the results were shared with my son and explained by the Wilderness therapist. My son's remark was, I finally know what I'm dealing with. He then came home after Evoke and therapeutic boarding school and refused to take his anxiety and ADHD medication. I could not control his choice and let go. Last month, he asked if I could go with him to reconnect with a psychiatrist and resume medication, as his first year of college was so difficult and he wants to resume medication. I said I can support that. It is his journey and struggle. My anxiety around the issue continues to be my work. So, so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. You know, I just read a quote today. I just shared it on social media. It's somebody else's quote. It's an old, I believe it's an old Irish proverb, and it says, "The death is the middle of a long life." Irish proverb. I love that quote. Death is the middle of the long life, a long life. And what that is referring to is this idea that in our growth as adults, we get to a certain age, at middle age, and we start to realize that the things that we've been taught aren't necessarily all true, and that the false self that we have developed to fit in, to be accepted, that it's not worth propping up anymore. Somebody gave me during my midlife crisis, the most significant of my many, when I was about 40, gave me a book called Death of the Hero, Birth of a Soul, about men's midlife crises. And it's this idea that that hero is the good one. That's the one I tried to be my whole life. That's why I was such a liar my entire life. I wouldn't have called myself that at the time, but I lied because I told people what they wanted to hear because I didn't want to be rejected or judged. And then at some point in my life, holding up that idea of being good was crushing me. And I decided to embark on the journey of becoming who I am. And at one point during that process, my therapist said to me, "You're just trying to find out what you like. You haven't grown up with that being the primary question. You've always been concerned with, understandably so, what's the right thing to do? What should I do? What shouldn't I do? What do good people do versus what do bad people do? But now you're just trying to find out what suits you. What color is your favorite color? What is your favorite dessert or your favorite breakfast food? Or do you want to go to this church or not this church? Do you want to try this as a part of your career or not?" And I love the gentleness of that idea. And I love your work because the way that you even told your story about your child and their exploration around their diagnoses is they're trying to figure themselves out. Remember, guys, we cannot understate the amount of power that we adults, we big people, we parents have over our children. And that's why we should use our purse strings when we feel it's the right thing to do for us, but we should use them with respect to that. We should use them with some kind of sensitivity and awareness that we have a great deal of power over the little people that we're charged with raising and with guiding. Again, I'm not trying to scare you to the point of inaction, but I'm just trying to state a fact of what is. You hold a tremendous space, a tremendous position in your child's psyche in a way that they will never hold in yours, ideally. And if we don't recognize that, I think we can be careless with our power. One of the things I'm careful of, and I slip sometimes, but even in our program, I have this idea that we don't ever use humor when it comes to a child's length of stay with us, a child's next stage after the therapeutic program. There used to be this old joke many years ago. I heard staff telling a student probably 20 years ago, pointing up to the sky at an airplane, 30,000 feet in the sky, and saying, "How far away to that plane? How far away is that plane? Do you think?" And the student guessing a distance, and the staff said it's about 7 or 8 weeks away. That's how far away it is. And I pulled the staff aside and I said, "We don't do that. They're too vulnerable. They're too fragile." The staff was trying to use humor to bond. We didn't fire him at the moment, but I'm sensitive to the power that we have. I'm sensitive. My anger is more terrifying to my children than their anger is to me. Ideally, now if I haven't grown up, if I haven't done my own work, then my children occupy the same place in my brain that my parents did, and that is a huge problem. It comes up when people say, my child, what if my child abandons me? And I explain in a technical sense, children can't abandon parents. Children are supposed to go off and live their life. And the more freely we let them go, thus communicating that our love comes with a sense of empowerment on their journey, the more easily that they're allowed to come and go in our lives, the more that they want to be around us. Unless, of course, they're saddled with guilt and anxiety and the obligation to take care of mom and dad, then they'll show up whether it's good for them or not. But we don't want that. We strive for something much, much larger than that. Are there any other questions, Olivia? Just pausing. Okay. I'm going to go over upcoming. I'll leave time for one or two more questions, but I'll go to upcoming announcements. My two books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon and Audible. If you want to do a deep dive into your own work, the thing that I recommend most to people is a therapeutic intensive. Our version of that is called Finding You for individuals. August 16th through 20th and September 20th through 21st are our next offering. These are beginning to fill up more and more in advance. So if you're interested, contact intensives@evoketherapy.com before waiting too long. We have an online offering, which is half the time and about a third of the price. We started it during the pandemic. I was really skeptical about doing therapeutic intensive work online. And after doing the first one in, I think, May of 2020, I was sold. It's a really good option if resources and time are limited. We have a Returning to You October 25th that I'll be running, and then I'm going back to the UK, I believe, in November. That will fill up instantly. In fact, it might be full the day that we opened it. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience. We also have custom Finding Connection intensives for couples and co-parents. We have Finding Family intensives for families. So if you're interested in that, contact intensives@evoketherapy.com. We're making a big change here. So this is new. The time for the broadcast is going to change coming up. And so is the time for the support groups. We're doing that so that you can attend both. The next support group for parents is this Thursday at 6:30 p.m. That'll be the last time that we'll overlap with during the webinar broadcast. After that, the next one is August 3rd. And from then on, they're going to be at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. 7 p.m. Mountain Time for support groups. Once a month, we have an alumni only meeting. We're looking at changing that one too. But for right now, the next one is August 22nd at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. If you're an intensives alumni, August 8th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time is the next offering. Look at our website on evoketherapy.com/family involvement for more dates and times. We have family treks for families who have a child in the wilderness that you can do in the middle of the program, multi-day, excuse me, multi-day experiences for families. You can do that during the program, at the end of the program, in between programs, before coming home. You can do it completely separate from Evoke. Think multi-day immersive family experiences in our wilderness therapy program. Contact admissions at evoketherapy.com if you're interested in more. If you would like a coach that can work with you virtually online for parents, couples, families, individuals, a whole host of reasons. Clarifying boundaries, reintegration of a child coming home, working on that, and just increasing your own self-awareness, life problems, issues like depression, anxiety. An Evoke coach who's trained in the attachment-based model can help you with that. Coaching at evoketherapy.com is where you go for that. We ask all current parents to try at least 6 12-step support groups. Any combination of Al-Anon.org, CODA.org, FamiliesAnonymous.org, or AdultChildren.org. Also, RefugeRecovery.org is a Buddhist-inspired recovery program, less of an emphasis on a higher power. And then the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI.org, has great classes and resources in local communities. So check them out. All these broadcasts are available on Spotify or your favorite podcast app. Just search Finding You, an Evoke Therapy podcast, or go to soundcloud.com and you can listen there on your computer. You can also watch the rebroadcast of the videos with the slides by going to Evoke's YouTube channel. You can always ask for copies of the slides. I should always mention that. You can find Evoke Therapy programs or me, Dr. Brad Reedy, on Twitter, Threads, and Instagram using the handles at Evoke Therapy and at Dr. Brad Reedy, respectively. You can find Evoke Intensives on Instagram by using the handle at Evoke Therapy Intensives. And on Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And don't forget to check out our blog, which has wonderful, heartfelt content from our staff at Evoke. If you want to give back for people that can't afford treatment, the 3 partners that we work closely with include ChooseMentalHealth.org, Sky'sTheLimitFund.org, and the EvokeFamilyFoundation.org. Just go check them out. You can earmark your tax deductible donation for a specific population that might be near and dear to your heart, or for a specific program if that matters to you. All right, any questions come in, Olivia? Looks like I'm done for tonight. All right, folks. As usual, I hope this is a helpful point of contact. My next broadcast will be July 27th at 6:30 p.m. I'm going to be talking about what our coaching program looks like, who it's for, what we accomplish there. And then starting on August 1st, from then on, instead of 6:30 Mountain Time, my broadcasts are going to start at 6 Mountain Time from here on out, so that we don't have parents that are having to choose between support groups and these broadcasts. So I hope this is a helpful point of contact for all of you. And as always, for and on behalf of the people that you love and the people that love you, thank you for showing up and being willing to do your work. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.